Thank you, Ashley. And good morning and welcome to those of you who are just joining us online this morning. We welcome you here to our continued journey on the celebration of the Protestant Reformation. Now, what we said last Sunday is that in 1517, on October 31st, Martin Luther tacked his 95 Theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg. I almost said California. Okay, I really got this down to a science here today. Germany. And from that moment on, we marked the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. Now, from last Sunday, I want to gather a couple pieces of the puzzle because they are important pieces. We need to remind ourselves that nothing ever happens out of context. Jesus of Nazareth was not out of context to his time and his place and his environment. Martin Luther was not out of context to his time and his place. So if we don't understand the context from which these people came, we don't get the nuances and the subtleties of what really is happening behind the scenes of the story. So we said that there were three major shifts, huge consciousness shifts that literally moved Western civilization, and I'm talking about Europe, from this track clear over to this track. And the first one was in 1438 when Gutenberg invented the printing press. So although in 1438 it wasn't a big deal, this idea that we could do movable type was something that began to be explored and expanded. And suddenly people said, you know, if we could do one, we could do two, we could do 100, and just keep reproducing. So this first innovation that shifted Western civilization, the printing press. The second one was really a culmination of things in 1492 when King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain finally defeated the Moors and pushed them back into North Africa. What was left in the wake, and it wasn't just a singular event, as I say, it happened over a course of time, was this huge influx of all this Greek literature, art, music, and culture that Western civilization had lost touch with over the years that we would call the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages. And so once the Roman Empire had collapsed, there was no conduit to share all of this information. So the Eastern Mediterranean world, of course, had all of this, centered in Greece and Turkey and the Middle East and Egypt. But the Western world had lost all sorts of touch with it. Now, suddenly, here comes this ancient literature, which predates many things. And we're going to talk about how that also had a huge impact on Martin Luther and his journey. And the third one, of course, in 1492, was the discovery of the New World. And that discovery of the New World was absolutely mind-blowing. Because always before, they thought if you traveled west, you hit India, and there you have it. If you traveled east, you hit India, and there you have it. That's as far as it goes. To now suddenly realize that there was this massive body in between, unexplored body, and even more exciting and important, inhabited body of land, was huge. Into all of this time, Martin Luther was born, 1489. Martin Luther is born into a family in Germany, and ostensibly the family wasn't really a peasant family, but they weren't really broke either. His father owned some mines, and He was the eldest of the family. So, of course, what Dad wants, the eldest of the family, primogenitor, we want our eldest son to have the best education and the best life. And Martin Luther was not stupid. He was a very bright man. And so father and mother scraped together, as you would do, to send him off to college. and they wanted him to be a lawyer because his dad felt that if he was a lawyer, then he would have a glorious career. And Dad might have thought so, but Martin Luther apparently didn't seem to think so too. So it goes, the story has it, and this is a very, sort of global sharing of Martin Luther's story. There's a current PBS series going on that I invite you to watch, and if you missed it, it's on YouTube. I've been watching a little bit of it. It's very good. It's very informative. But Martin Luther goes off to school. He becomes educated in a very short period of time. He's graduated. And he's all signed up for getting into law school. He doesn't want to go to law school. How does one get out of these things? Because the family, and it's not just Dad, but it's the whole family, assumes he's going to be a lawyer. Everything is invested in him going to be a lawyer. Well, the story has it that he has a thunderstorm conversion. I like that, the thunderstorm conversion. In 1505, Martin Luther was walking, apparently late at night, and there was a bad lightning and thunderstorm. Now, whether the lightning struck near Martin Luther, whether he just was scared out of his wits, whatever it might have been, he prayed to St. Anne, the mother of Mary, the mother of the Virgin Mary. He prayed to St. Anne and said, if I get out of this, I'll become a monk. One wonders if he was serious, or one wonders, was he trying to get away from Dad? Whatever the case may be, we don't really know why he felt he was in danger of dying that night, so much so that he prayed to be saved, and not only to be saved, but that he would commit his life to being a monk. Sure enough, he went then the very following year and became an Augustinian monk, followers of St. Augustine. So he goes into the monastery. He's there, and that wasn't such a happy thing either, but he's learning new things. He's doing all the rituals and the prayers and the programs that he's supposed to be. But it's interesting that Martin Luther felt that he never made the grade with God, that he was desperately worried he was going to go to hell. He felt that all along, and no matter what he did, no matter how many hours of prayer, no matter how much work, he felt that he was never good enough in the sight of God. And this drove him constantly. And so in around 1515, as a representative of his monastic tradition, he was sent to Rome. And can you imagine this young man? He was, I think, 27 at the time. I'm going to go to Rome. I'm going to see the Pope. He had these expectations of a spiritual experience. He was going to go there, and it was almost like Jesus was coming down right then, because he was going to the seat of the holy. But what happened? When he got to Rome, what he saw was corruption. When he got to Rome, he saw anything but holy. When he got to Rome, he was so disillusioned by what he felt was just a mockery of the Roman Catholic tradition, that he was angry and he was bitter, and he came back to Germany festering inside. And it was that festering inside 2 years later that prompted him to put up the 95 Theses. Because basically what the theses were is sort of a compilation of everything he felt the Catholic Church was doing wrong. Now you can imagine that kind of enamored him with the Catholic Church a lot. But he posted these publicly. Now, here's what's interesting. Within 2 weeks, everybody in Germany had a copy. How did that happen? The printing press was hot, sending around flyers to the towns and the fiefdoms about how Martin Luther was standing up against the Catholic Church. And I want you to know, put this in the back of your disk drive, just a few years before that, people were burned at the stake for this kind of stuff. This is not, this is not just light and airy, and Martin Luther just one day thought he'd write these up, and he knew very clearly that this was a line he drew in the sand, an act of rebellion. And so, it wasn't long before the pushback came. Because you see, it's one thing if just you put up some 95 theses and nobody ever reads them and nobody ever hears about it. It's another thing of all Germany to be reading it and saying, you know what, I think he's got a point here. Look at that, number 93 is pretty good. We ought to do that. And so we see that in 1521, Martin Luther is brought before the courts. It ended up, one of the biographers said, it just ended up in a great shouting match. And eventually the emperor stood up and said, well, I'm going to outshout you. You're excommunicated. Now, for us today, that's like, and so what does that mean? Obviously, the first and foremost thing is, you are no longer welcome in a Catholic church. But more importantly, remember, Martin Luther was a monk. Where did he live? In a monastery. Where was his home? In a monastery. Who was it funded by? The Catholic Church. Who funded his education? The Catholic Church. Who were his friends? The Catholic Church. And now they're saying, don't even bother coming home. The emperors went as far as to say, if anyone should encounter Martin Luther on the road and happen to kill him, oh darn. There will be no ramifications for killing him. Isn't that interesting? What's his name? We'll just get rid of him. We'll just get rid of him. But Frederick III of Wittenberg said, something's cool here. Something's going on here. Something's going on. And so he sent three hooded men, to take Martin Luther and bring him back to the Wittenberg Castle. When he was at the Wittenberg Castle, although he was under house arrest, so to speak, that was the year in which Martin Luther translated the Bible into German. Now hear this very clearly. He did not use the Latin Vulgate. He used the Greek version of the Bible. And he didn't translate the Greek version of the Bible to Latin that only a priest could read. He translated it to what language? The vernacular of the people. All of a sudden, on Sunday morning, I'm up here preaching, reading from the Bible in Latin, and somebody says, oh, wait a minute, but in chapter 3, that's not what my Bible says. How you know that? Well, I'm reading it in German. Priests were not happy about that. I'm just going to say. So the story of Martin Luther then, it sort of evolves. And then, like a lot of movements, our own unity movement is another case in point. Charles and Myrtle Fillmore were about exploring different concepts and ideas about God, about prayer, about healing. It was not in the early mindset that, we're going to start unity churches all over the world. I have this global vision. That's not where it started. It started as just a couple people having a prayer meeting every night at 9 o'clock in the home of Charles and Myrtle Fillmore. That's where it started. Okay? Well, same with Martin Luther. We just translated the Bible, and then what happened? The whole Lutheran movement was born. Ultimately, he died fairly young. He married, and he had 6 children. He died fairly young in 1546 of natural causes, probably brought upon by the malnutrition and sort of the life that he had to lead in trying to get away from people every time he was in a new environment. Why does the story of Martin Luther sort of speak, or how does it speak to us today? I think there's 3 separate ways. First and foremost is spiritually. What is hard for us to understand, because we live in a world that is multifaceted Protestant churches, it's hard for us to understand the power of the Roman Catholic Church because it is twofold, all right? When Rome fell, ostensibly in 425, there was nothing to take it over. There was no power. There was a vacuum of power in Europe. And into that power stepped the Roman Catholic Church. Now, we're talking the Western Church. We're no longer talking about the Eastern Church. They stepped in, and what did they provide? Healing. They went out to the streets. The Roman Empire, yes, they were, the barbarians invaded, but they were dying from within, from plague. So we saw that, what the church said is, I know that this life is terrible. I know that you're miserable, but heaven waits you. Think of the power of that message. I'm suffering. I'm cold. I'm starving to death. People are beating down the doors, the Viking invasions, the bubonic plague. All of this stuff is in the mix. And somebody promises me a better life. Think about it. What did Ed McMahon promise you if you get into the Publishers Clearinghouse sweepstake? A better life. Is there any difference? A better life will be yours. How do I get that better life? It's the afterlife in heaven. And so the church had this twofold position in people's lives. If you follow the rules of the church, then you will be assured of heaven. Then, as time went on, what happens is the church gets more and more and more power, and then they said, well, here's who's going to succeed, whose property is what, and it gets more and more powerful as the years and years go on. So now, here's Martin Luther, who says, listen, you guys, you don't need the Catholic Church. Okay, maybe we don't need the Catholic Church power, but what do we still need? The promise of salvation. The promise of a better life. Can you imagine how people felt off-center, scared? If I follow Martin Luther, I believe he's right, but then I divorce myself from the promise of salvation. It's not an easy win. And even today, folks, we want a guarantee of a better life. Do not, just because we're talking about the Catholic Church and Martin Luther of 1517, do not think that you don't want a better life. Because all of us here are thinking the same thing. I wish somebody would guarantee me a better life, whether it's this one or in the future. There's something about that is a soul need that we have. Can I guarantee you this is what you're to think about God? Can I guarantee you this is what heaven will be like? Can I guarantee you? No, I cannot. But sometimes you ask, why are those churches growing so fast? Because they offer a guarantee. All you have to do is the 7 steps. All you have to do is tithe. All you have to do is show up. All you have to do is, and I can do those 8 things, I am assured. So Martin Luther comes into this picture, and he literally rattles the foundational belief of spirituality. He says there are no guarantees. Wow, that's earth-shaking. Number 2, he shakes the world politically. He's upset the balance of power. Frederick III, who came and rescued Martin Luther, was not being a nice guy. He understood clearly that Luther was going to lead the charge, even though Luther didn't know that, against the power of the Catholic Church. And where, my friends, did that power come from? Was it military might, or was it the power of the press? Today in our world, do we honestly think things are going to change from the level of agreements and governments and military might? It's going to change. You have it all in your pocket. It's called an internet connection. It's called a cell phone. It's called an email. You can quickly look up, pass on, share, friend, like, whatever you want to do. It's the same power that Martin Luther utilized to make this incredible spiritual shift. We see it today. We are not exempt. We have the same not the same tools, but we have the tools to make radical shift in our world. And it's right there in our hands. How often have we seen policy, procedures, whatever it might be, change because of the push and the pressure of the internet world against things that are happening in our world? So there's that power. What about the future? Martin Luther also impacted the future. I think it's obvious the first impact was that one Holy Roman Catholic Church became all of these Protestant churches. You go to every corner, and there's another Protestant church. There's a Baptist, and there's the Disciples of Christ, and there's Presbyterians, and there's Lutherans, and there's Methodists, and there's all of them. You say, well, how did that happen? Because when Luther said, you and you alone can read Scripture, and you have a copy of it in your hand, in your own language, then you can decide for yourself what Spirit is speaking to your heart. And so we began to see that fragmentation. Another thing, kind of one of the things that scholars sort of debate about Luther, is Luther was extremely anti-Semitic. Now think about where Luther is writing. In Germany. In Germany. Because he believed, as many did, that the Jews killed Jesus, and therefore the Jews should be killed. Does that live in a consciousness in Germany? Did we not see it? Yes, of course we did. And it's still resonant there. So to think, oh, well, that's about Martin Luther, that's back in the 15th, that's 500 years ago. It still is alive today. It still has some power today. So the story of Martin Luther is a really, really interesting story, because a man who started out, like, as I say, our own Charles and Myrtle Fillmore never started out to lead a revolution, but saw something different, understood something different in their soul journey. And they began to act out of that. And each and every one of us do the same thing. Maybe we don't change the course of the world, but we don't know that. When we follow our light, when we follow that longing within us to invest in our spiritual journey, we begin to hear differently, we begin to walk differently, we begin to see differently. So Martin Luther has set the stage now. Next Sunday we're going to talk about the conflict with the Catholic Church, about the selling of the indulgences. Back again to that promise of salvation, and how the promise of salvation is not about money. It is about your own personal journey with God. I want to thank you for joining us today, and God bless.